Okay, there's two Bigfoots. I don't know.
April 2026 produced the clearest Bigfoot footage ever captured in a single month. Not just a vague figure in the tree line, but clear and undeniable proof. Things Bigfoot actually does that almost never get documented this blatantly. And the further down this list of clips you get, the more obvious his existence becomes. The last clip on most people's lists would be the first one I'd show anyone who thinks this subject is a joke. A doorbell camera in suburban Ohio, a residential neighborhood, not a forest, not a trail, not somewhere remote where you'd expect something like this to turn up. A well-lit driveway on an ordinary night, a father coming home, the kind of footage that's so completely unremarkable in its setting that what happens in it takes a full second to register the first time you watch it. He pulls in, gets out of his car, and walks up to his front door with his keys in his hand. Nothing about the first few seconds feels unusual at all, just a normal night, a normal routine. And then you notice it, standing maybe 6 feet behind him, not moving, not making a sound. Just there in the light, upright, arms at its sides, while he has no idea. He's unlocking his door, focused on getting inside, and the entire time this thing is right behind him, in a lit driveway, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, fully visible to a camera he doesn't even realize is recording. That's the moment the footage is really built around. Not the arrival, not the 40 seconds after, but those specific few seconds at the door. He's stationary, focused on a small mechanical task. Keys in the lock, close enough to the frame of the door that the space behind him is open and unobstructed. And it's standing there in that open space at a distance you could cross in 2 steps. The camera holds both of them in the same frame at the same time. A man completely absorbed in something routine and something enormous completely still, just feet behind him. And the contrast between those 2 states is what makes that moment stick. Total unawareness on one side, complete stillness on the other, separated by almost no distance. I've watched this clip over and over, and every time it comes into frame, there's that same moment where it hits you. How does he not know it's there? He goes inside, the door shuts, and it just stays. Not for a second or two, but for almost a full minute, standing there in the open like nothing about this situation is strange. Then eventually, it just turns and walks off. That's the part that doesn't sit right. It doesn't react when the door closes, doesn't move when the light inside turns on, doesn't act startled or rushed in any way. It just stands there for a while, like it's watching or thinking, and then leaves when it decides to. That doesn't feel like something that wandered into the wrong yard or got spooked out of the trees. It feels intentional, like it chose to be there and knew exactly what it was doing, while the person it was watching had no idea any of it was happening. Researchers have described something they call proximity tolerance behavior for years. The idea that these things will sometimes get close to humans, not to attack, not to make contact, but specifically to observe at close range without being detected. I'll be honest, I always treated that particular field note detail with some skepticism because it sounds like the kind of thing that's easy to claim and impossible to verify. This footage is the verification. Whatever that thing was doing in that driveway, it was doing it with full awareness that the man didn't know it was there, and it maintained that position for 40 seconds after he went inside. That's not a proximity accident. That's a choice. But here's what I think gets overlooked when people focus on the proximity alone: the location. This is Ohio. This is a suburb with neighbors within shouting distance, with porch lights and motion sensors, and the general ambient noise of a residential street at night. This isn't a rural property on the edge of a forest where you might expect the boundary between wilderness and human space to be blurry. This is deep inside human territory, in the kind of neighborhood where the nearest tree line might be a mile away. And something that size, and you can gauge the size against the car, against the door frame, against the height of the man himself, was standing in that driveway like it had navigated there with a purpose. That implies a range of movement and a comfort with human environments that the conventional framing of this subject has never seriously accounted for. We talk about these things like they belong to the wilderness, like they're creatures of remote forests and mountain corridors. But the Ohio footage doesn't come from a remote forest. It comes from a suburb, and if it's operating that comfortably in a lit residential driveway, then the question of where exactly its territory ends and where ours begins becomes a much harder question to answer than most people are prepared for. What I keep returning to is the question of what it was actually doing there. Because the Ohio footage doesn't give you an answer. It gives you a behavior and leaves the reason for it completely open. It wasn't eating. It wasn't building anything. It wasn't responding to a stimulus that we can identify from the footage. It was watching a man come home, and then it stood in his driveway for 40 seconds after he went inside, and then it left. And if that's what it looks like when this thing is just observing, then the question that follows is an uncomfortable one. How often is this happening in places without cameras? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and I think that's exactly the point. The second clip comes from rural West Virginia, and where the Ohio footage is unsettling because of how close it gets, this one is unsettling for a completely different reason, because of how deliberate and structured the behavior is. Home security camera, color footage, captured in the afternoon with clear lighting and a clean angle on the edge of the property. The property belongs to someone who had been doing what some researchers call habituation work, leaving objects and small amounts of food at a consistent location on the property line over a period of weeks, trying to establish a recognizable pattern of exchange. I've always been a little skeptical of that methodology, if I'm being honest. It sounds rigorous when you describe it in field notes, but in practice it can easily become someone leaving snacks in the woods and reading meaning into the fact that they disappear. Animals take food. That's not evidence of anything, but this footage isn't about food disappearing. This footage shows the response. The camera catches it walking to the edge of the property in the afternoon. It moves without any urgency, fully upright, and it goes directly to the spot where the researcher had placed a small object as part of the exchange. Not food, just an object, something deliberately chosen and positioned. The directness of that approach is worth pausing on because it doesn't match how an animal moves towards something unfamiliar. Animals hesitate, they circle, pause, check from a distance, approach and retreat before committing. None of that is present here. It walks straight to the location the way you walk to something you already know is there. There's no hesitation at the edge of the property, no pause before closing the final distance. The movement suggests prior awareness, not discovery, but execution of something already decided before it entered the frame. It stops at that spot, reaches down, and picks the object up. And then it does something I have genuinely never seen documented clearly on camera before. It examines it, not a quick grab and toss, not a sniff and drop. It holds the object, turns it, looks at it the way you'd look at something you were actually curious about, something you were trying to understand. Then it places it back down, exactly where it found it. And before it leaves, it arranges a small pile of stones in the same spot where the object had been sitting. A deliberate, arranged pile of stones, left in exchange for an object that was examined and returned. I don't know what to do with that. I've sat with this clip for a long time, and I still don't have a clean way to process it, because what it shows isn't instinct, and it isn't territorial behavior, and it isn't a stress response. What it shows is something that understood the implicit structure of what was being offered. Here is an object, here is a location, here is a repeated pattern, and responded to it within that same structure. It engaged with the exchange on its own terms. It left something behind, in the same spot, on purpose. But the detail I keep coming back to isn't the stones themselves, it's the fact that it returned the object first. It picked it up, examined it, and put it back exactly where it found it before leaving the stones. That's a sequence of decisions. It didn't take the object. It didn't discard it. It chose to return it to its original position and then add something of its own alongside it. That tells you something specific about how it understood the interaction, not as a transaction where one thing gets replaced by another, but as something more like a conversation. Here is what you left. I looked at it. Here is what I'm adding. The object stays because the object was yours. The stones are mine. That's not a territorial response. That's not instinct. That's an understanding of ownership and exchange that I find genuinely difficult to categorize using any conventional framework for animal behavior. Researchers have been documenting this exchange behavior for years across multiple regions, and it's one of those things that consistently gets dismissed because it sounds too convenient, too anthropomorphic, too much like something you'd invent to make the subject seem more compelling than it is. But watching it happen in real time, in color, in the afternoon, on a home security camera that wasn't even set up specifically to capture this, it stops being a field note detail and becomes something you have to actually reckon with. Something out there understood what was being offered and chose to respond to it. And whatever it communicated with that pile of arranged stones, it communicated it intentionally. The third clip is the one that, from a pure documentation standpoint, might be the most significant of the 5. Not because of what it looks like, though the image quality is genuinely exceptional, but because of what you can hear before you ever see anything. And while putting this together, we ended up going deeper than just these clips. There are other cases, same patterns, different places, details that start to line up. We compiled everything in one place, so if you want to look into it further, the link is in the description. Dash cam footage from a forest road in northern Minnesota. Dense tree cover on both sides, maybe 20 feet of visibility before the tree line closes in completely. Daytime, clear conditions, nothing unusual about the first few seconds of the clip. The driver is moving at a normal speed and the road ahead is empty. And then the audio catches something that stops the whole clip in its tracks before the visual event even happens. Wood knocking, sharp, deliberate strikes, not a branch falling, not a random impact, not the kind of ambient forest sound that gets misidentified on recordings. 2 strikes, a pause, then 2 more. The rhythm is intentional in a way that's immediately apparent even if you've never heard a field recording of this behavior before. Researchers have been documenting wood knocking for decades and describing it as a signaling behavior used between individuals across distance, a way of communicating location or status through deliberate percussion against tree trunks. I've heard field recordings of it, but hearing it captured incidentally on dashcam audio by someone who was just driving down a road is a different experience entirely. It sounds exactly like what it's always been described as: structured, deliberate, like something is sending a message to something else. And then, 20 feet ahead of the vehicle, it steps out of the tree line. Full body, daylight, unhurried. It crosses the road at a pace that isn't rushed, not fleeing, not startled, not reacting to the vehicle the way an animal that had been surprised would react. It moves across the frame with a stride length and an arm swing that doesn't hold up to any conventional explanation, and at some point during that crossing, it turns and looks directly into the windshield. Not a glance, a sustained look. It holds that for a moment, and then it continues walking and disappears into the tree line on the other side of the road. The arm swing is one of the details analysts consistently focus on in bipedal footage because it's difficult to fake and difficult to misinterpret. Human arm motion follows a predictable pattern tied to shoulder width, stride, and balance. What shows up here doesn't match that pattern. The swing is longer, lower, and counter-rotates against the torso in a way that suggests a different structural alignment, particularly in the shoulders and upper body mass distribution. You can question lighting, distance, even scale, but sustained movement like this, in clear daylight and across multiple steps, gives you something far more stable to evaluate. The whole crossing lasts maybe 8 seconds, but there's more going on in those 8 seconds than in most footage I've seen in years. You've got the audio first, the wood knocking, clear and deliberate, happening before anything steps into view, which means whatever made that sound was already there and already signaling before it ever came out onto the road. Then you have the movement, the gait, the posture, the arm swing. None of it lines up cleanly with a human. And then there's that look. It turns toward the windshield and holds it, not like an animal reacting to a car, but like something that recognized it was being observed and chose to acknowledge it. That sequence is what makes this clip stand out. Signal, then appearance, then eye contact. That's not a random crossing. It feels structured, and the fact that the wood knocking happens just seconds before it steps out makes it much harder to write off, because it suggests the crossing wasn't accidental. Something was happening right before it appeared, and whatever that was, the timing lines up too closely to ignore. The fourth clip is the one that hits differently depending on what you already know about how these encounters tend to unfold, and it's the one I think most people underestimate when they first watch it. A hiker's phone, Appalachian Trail, Tennessee. The footage starts the way a lot of trail videos do. Someone walking, filming the path ahead, nothing remarkable about the surroundings. And then the hiker stops. He doesn't stop because he sees something. He doesn't stop because he hears something. He stops because something feels wrong. And that distinction is the most important thing about this entire clip. One of the most consistently reported elements in close proximity encounters, reported independently, across decades, across geography, by people who have never read each other's accounts, is a specific physical sensation that precedes the visual sighting. Not a sound, not a movement, not anything the witness can point to as a concrete trigger. Just a sudden, sourceless dread. An overwhelming sense that something is not right, that the environment has shifted in some way that the conscious mind can't identify, but the body is already responding to. Witnesses describe it as feeling wrong rather than seeing or hearing something wrong. And the consistency of that description across completely unrelated accounts is one of the things that makes it worth taking seriously. Researchers have connected this to infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below 20 hertz, below the threshold of human hearing that the body registers physically, rather than audibly. Large predators produce it. The documented effects on humans include unease, disorientation, nausea, and a sense of dread that feels irrational because there's no conscious auditory source to attach it to. You feel it before you understand why you feel it, and by the time you understand why, the source is already close. That's the part that unsettles me most about this particular behavior, the idea that an encounter can begin affecting you before you're even aware one is happening. Your body is already in a threat response before your brain has registered a threat. And I think about what that actually means experientially, not just clinically. You're on a trail. Nothing has changed visually. The trees look the same, the light looks the same, the path ahead is clear. And then something shifts in you that you can't name. A weight in your chest that wasn't there a second ago. A sudden, irrational certainty that you need to stop moving. Your instincts are screaming at you and you don't know why. And the reason you don't know why is that the thing causing it is operating below the frequency your ears can process. You are being affected by something you are physically incapable of hearing. And by the time that feeling is strong enough to make you stop, it's already close enough to be doing that to you. That's not a warning system that gives you time to react. That's a warning system that tells you it's already too late to put distance between you and whatever is out there. The footage supports that in a way you can actually observe. When the hiker stops, there's no visible or audible trigger in the recording. Nothing in the frame that explains the reaction. He stops because of something the camera cannot capture. A few seconds later, when he finally locates it, the camera movement reveals something important. His head turns first, and the phone follows slightly behind. That delay means his eyes found the source before he consciously adjusted the camera. It isn't a slow scan landing on a target. It's attention being pulled to a specific point, and then the device catching up to that realization. Whatever caused the initial reaction didn't just make him stop. It aligned his attention with a location before he deliberately chose to look. That's exactly what happens in this clip. The hiker stops. You can see in the way he moves, in how he holds the phone, that he's unsettled, in a way he can't explain. He looks around. He scans the trees. And then he looks up, across a gap in the tree cover, and he sees it, standing 60 feet away, already watching him. It's not moving toward him, not reacting to being spotted, not doing anything that suggests it was surprised by the eye contact. It's just standing there, in the open, watching, the way something watches when it's been watching for a while and has no particular reason to stop. The timeline is the thing that matters here. The hiker stopped because of the feeling. The feeling came before the sighting, which means whatever produced that infrasound sensation was already close enough to affect him physically before he ever turned to look. It was already there, already operating, and he had no idea until his own body told him something was wrong. And even then, it took him another several seconds to find it visually. By the time he saw it, it had already been present long enough to affect him at a physiological level. That's a sequence, not a coincidence. And that sequence matches the field accounts with a precision that's very hard to explain away. The fifth clip is the one I want to spend the most time on because I think it's the most misunderstood of the five and also, in some ways, the most consequential in terms of what it actually tells us. Pacific Northwest, a creek bed, trail camera footage captured in full daylight with a clear image and a good angle on the area being monitored. The camera had been positioned at a property boundary, the kind of placement researchers use when they're tracking activity in a specific corridor over time. And what it caught wasn't a sighting in the traditional sense. There's no dramatic moment of emergence, no crossing, no eye contact with the lens. What it caught was something already in the middle of doing something, and the something it was doing is the reason this clip matters as much as it does. It's building a structure. Two young saplings, flexible enough to be bent without breaking, being worked into a deliberate X formation right at the property boundary line. And the footage shows the process, not just the finished result, but the actual construction. You can watch it select the saplings, bend the first one, hold it in position, bring the second one across, and lock them together. And then it stops. There's no visible adjustment phase, no testing of the structure, no inspection the way you would expect if the result were uncertain. It straightens, takes a small step back, and orients toward the tree line. The finished structure holds its attention only briefly before it leaves the frame. That sequence suggests the outcome was already defined before the process began. The construction isn't exploratory. It follows through to a known result, and once that result is achieved, there's nothing further to evaluate. The finished structure is clean and intentional, and it's placed exactly at the line where the monitored property ends and the forest begins. Not 20 feet into the woods, not in a clearing somewhere. At the boundary, at the line. Tree structures, X formations, arches, leaners, deliberate arrangements of bent or broken saplings have been documented across North America for decades by researchers working in completely separate regions who arrived at consistent conclusions about what they represent. X formations appear at boundaries, at the edges of human-occupied land, at the margins between spaces. Arches appear at entry points and along travel corridors. The placements aren't random, and they aren't the result of wind or animal movement or coincidental growth patterns. They're placed, and they're placed in ways that suggest an understanding of spatial boundaries, of where one kind of territory ends and another begins. I've seen photographs of these structures. I've read the field documentation. But watching one being built, watching the deliberate, sequential process of selecting the material, bending it, locking it, placing it at a specific location, changes the nature of the evidence in a way that photographs of finished structures simply cannot. A photograph of a bent sapling can always be explained away. Footage of the construction process doesn't have that exit. You're watching a decision being made and executed. You're watching something choose a location, choose the material, and produce a finished structure that matches a pattern documented across thousands of miles of geography by researchers who have never been in contact with each other. What that implies about territory and spatial awareness is something I find genuinely difficult to sit with, because it means whatever built that structure understood that a boundary existed at that specific location. It understood the concept of a line between spaces, and it chose to mark that line in a way that's consistent with how these markers have been documented continent-wide for decades. That's not animal behavior in any framework I know how to apply. Animals mark territory, but they don't build structures at the edges of human property lines that mirror a documented pattern across an entire continent. That's something operating with a level of spatial and communicative awareness that doesn't fit any conventional category. And that's the point where most people would stop. You've seen enough to recognize that something is happening, and it's easy to leave it there. But the footage doesn't let you do that. Because once you've seen more than one of these, they stop feeling separate. The details carry over, the way it moves, the way it positions itself, the timing of when it acts and when it doesn't. Those patterns don't reset, they persist, and that changes what you're actually looking at. April 2026 didn't just produce clearer footage, it captured behavior that holds up no matter where you look at it from. This is the clearest Bigfoot footage ever captured in a single month, not because of how it looks, but because of what it's doing.